Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to share my slides. So as I'm doing that, let me just start by, before I introduce ours, let me start by acknowledging that I'm here on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and let me pay my respects to elders past, present, and also many of the courageous young First Nations people who are continuing the fight against colonization, because this is stolen land. I want to start by introducing who we are. So my name's Tim. I'm a PhD candidate at the Melbourne School of Computing and Information Systems and a research fellow at the Melbourne School of Government. And I've got Zeng here with me, who's a master's student at the School of Computing and Information Systems. I've been supervising Zeng on his master's project for the last year now, and we're going to share some of that today. I'm going to go through the introduction. I'm going to hand over to Zeng for the methods and results, but I'm going to come back to conclude. I just want to acknowledge that this is part of a broader project of work that I'm leading around digitization of social care and disability. So this is a very small project, but I think it's got some really interesting findings, which hopefully you all find interesting as well. Feel free to follow along on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. Zeng and I are both on LinkedIn if you want to connect as well. So let's get started. So we all know, most of us are probably especially aware in times of COVID, that we are seeing a rapid digitalization of government and essential services. And by essential services, I mean your power companies, your water companies. And what's interesting about these services is that you don't really have a choice whether or not you engage with them, right? Like if I wanted to go and, I don't know, buy a game from EB Games, I would have a choice about whether or not I go into store, whether or not I go online, or whether or not I just go to some other service that meets my needs. But when it comes to places like MyGov, Aged Care, NDIS, Telstra, Optus, you know, if we want to live in this world, we need to engage with these services. There's not really any choice. And as these services move online and digitize, we have to ask the question, how do we make sure that their digital platforms, which in many cases are becoming their main platforms, are accessible and equitable to all people? So from my background, focusing on disability, we focused mainly on disability services and places like the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but also Aged Care. They both have online portals and also websites, and it's a real interest of ours how they are accessible to a wide range of groups. Now, for this project, we focus specifically on culturally and linguistically diverse communities who also have experiences of cognitive disability. And the reason we did this is because Zeng has an interest in culturally and linguistically diverse groups and disability. I have a big interest in disability and intersectionality, but also we know that in Australia, we have a huge population of people who come from what we can broadly term culturally and linguistically diverse communities, including first, second, and third generation migrants. Refugees, asylum seekers, etc. But all of these people, they experience similar rates of disability as non-migrant, non-cloud groups. However, across these different populations, we see a much lower engagement with disability services. So there's lots of questions here about why that is. What is stopping this community accessing disability services, even though at the levels we would expect them to see? And one of the things we hypothesized or thought about is it could be that the information presented and the ways we engage with these services online aren't accessible. So we started with a review of the literature to kind of look at, okay, well, what are the barriers and enablers for cold groups with online services, for cognitive disability, and is there any intersection at the moment in the literature? For cold groups, we found that there were language barriers, cultural barriers, unfamiliarity with Western-orientated websites, and distrust or suspicion of disability services. So the first one probably makes sense in terms of a lot of websites, especially government websites, their main language is English. They might provide translations in other languages, but not all languages. And an interesting point to reflect on, which actually Zeng wrote up and just got me thinking all over the place, is that we tend to provide translation for dominant migrant groups. So we say that a large percentage of migrants in Australia come from this country, therefore we're going to provide translations in this language. But we don't actually provide translations for groups that might be in the most vulnerable situation, which might come from might have other language needs. There's cultural barriers. This can relate to stigma or in terms of different relationships in a family unit or in a community about who should be accessing services or online. Something that I was very unfamiliar with as someone who grew up in Australia, has really only accessed Australian or Western-orientated websites, is that the way we present information can be very different to other than information is presented in other countries or communities. And finally, distrust or suspicion of disability services. It's probably for some people in Australia, this might be something which is thought about a lot, but for many of us, we tend to trust our government. We go into MyGov, we go into our census when it works. But for some people who come to Australia from other countries where the government doesn't provide any of these services, the idea that the government would in general and that they should have access to those services might be a foreign idea, and there may be issues around trust. For cognitive disability, the main barriers were websites that didn't meet or didn't provide ways for people with different cognitive abilities to use those websites. Language skills could be an issue around the lack of use of plain English or too much information, but also stigma around actually maybe looking for support or using different options to access websites if someone might struggle with using them. We then had a look, well, I should say that we didn't find any literature really at the intersection. Let me say that at the out point in terms of having a look at the intersectionality issues of CULT groups with a cognitive disability and what barriers they faced. But we then went and had a look at the design guidelines to ask, has someone already answered this issue? Has someone already come up with a set of design guidelines that kind of meet this population that we're interested in their needs? So we found some guidelines for CULT groups from the Australian government and the Digital Transformation Agency, and they're outlined there in terms of what they present. And we also found guidelines that all of you will be very familiar with on disability and cognitive disability from some of the major organisations in this space. And what you'll see across both of these is that they do address some of these issues of language barriers, cognitive abilities, but they don't really address some of these more conceptual issues around how do we even address trust of government or stigma or the idea that someone even can access a service. And we think they don't assess the intersectionality elements. So the aim of this study was to explore the literature and then go out and talk to some people about what might these intersectionality elements be, and then to establish a set of design guidelines specific to CULT groups with cognitive disabilities. So I'm going to pass over to Zeng now to talk about how we did this.
Yeah, thanks, T. So I'm going to introduce the methods and results of this study. So this study consists of 4 phases corresponding to 4 different methods. So I'm going to introduce them one by one. Yeah. So phase 1 is scoping review. So this study was run as a master's project. So basically I was given around 5 weeks to finish the literature review. So given the time constraint, I chose to conduct a scoping review because it provides me a clear framework to help me identify relevant studies, to help me chart the results. And compared to the systematic review, this method is rigorous, effective, and economic. So this phase consists of 5 stages. So I'm going to have a quick walkthrough of them. Next. Yeah, sorry. The first method is scoping. Scoping is to identify research questions. And after several rounds of discussion within our team, our final research questions are regarding the barriers and needs of CULT groups with cognitive disabilities, and the best practice guidelines for them, and the gaps between the guidelines and the actual implementation of government portals in Australia. Move on to the next stage is to identify relevant studies. So based on research questions, we developed a series of research terms like CULT, immigrants, cognitive disability, websites, universal design, something like that. And in this stage, we also determined what databases and search engines to use and what types of studies to incorporate. The next stage is about study selection. So firstly, we set about clear standards for including and excluding studies. After that, we performed searching, selecting, and got our final results. So of the 201 results matched, we selected 75 papers for text reading, and we also selected 5 credible and highly relevant sources of guidelines for drafting the specific guidelines for our target audience. The next stage is to chart the results. While for text reading, I use this tabular template to record my notes about papers, like the methods and the key findings and my reflections on them. After that, I categorize those papers and notes by study objects and study aims. So move on to the final stage, is to summarize and report the findings. So basically, I categorize those findings into two themes. The first thing is about the experience of our target audience in accessing websites. It includes three categories, respectively, barriers, needs, and facilitators. For example, barriers, we found the language barrier, cultural barrier, stigma, etc. And the next thing is guidelines for the guidelines of our target audience for the design of government portals. So after going we picked out those guidelines specifically fix the barriers of our target audience, or specifically meet the needs of our target barriers. We analyze them, synthesize them down, and categorize them into different sections. And our final set of guidelines includes 4 sections, and I will give more details in introducing these guidelines in the next section. So move on to next phase. Kim, next phase. Next slide. Sorry.
It's up on my screen. I'm not sure if it's loading on yours.
Okay, sorry. So phase 2 is to have interviews. So I chose to conduct semi-structured interviews because it provides more flexibility and space to probe deeply into the interview topics. So based on the outcomes of phase 1 and our original research questions, I drafted a series of interview questions. After that, I recruited participants from our research network and some professional platforms like LinkedIn. After that, we conducted interviews, and each interview lasted for 30 to 40 minutes. So for the interviewees, we chose to interview with experts in the industry who have rich experience working with our target audience. And the final sample size of participants is 4. Yeah, we know the sample size is small, and it was mainly trade-off between our research goals and the time constraint of the study. And of all participants, 3 of them are managers with over 10 years experience working with our target audience. And another participant is a speech pathologist who has been researching and supporting our target audience. And they all are experienced experts, and we've got much more feedback from them than expected. So the next phase is data analysis. So I used the method of semantic analysis because of its flexibility in helping explore complex qualitative data. The 2 steps. Step 1 is called the transcripts. Step 2 is analyze all transcripts semantically. So while generating scenes of this data, I used a mixed way of deductive and inductive content analysis. So for deductive content analysis, all transcripts were divided by questions, and all questions were compared and analyzed to answer questions. For inductive content analysis, I aggregate all sharings from interviewees and compare and analyze them from the scratch, and try to make some assumptions and go back to the literature and try to find some evidence to support my findings. So next phase is the last phase is heuristic walkthrough. So at this point, actually, we have our final guidelines that had been refined based on our interview feedback. So by referring to the guidelines we established, we conducted a heuristic analysis on some popular government portals in Australia, like NDIS, Centrelink, and MyGov. And we found some accessibility and usability issues that violated our guidelines. So move on to the next section. This is an overview of the study results, and corresponding to different phases, it has different outcomes. So basically, we generated our guidelines in phase 1 based on the outcomes of the scope review, and we got our refined guidelines in phase 3 based on the interview feedback in phase 2. And in the last phase, we applied these guidelines, and we use these guidelines to identify the gaps between the guidelines and the current government portals. Move on to the next slide. Our core result is a set of guidelines for government portals considering the digital needs of our target audience, and it consists of 2 parts. Part 1 is a list of questions that are recommended to the users of guidelines to consider. So we imagine the users of guidelines, including public servants and policymakers and web designers, and we want them to go through these questions to help them remind something. Like these questions including like who are the target users of your website? Is English their first language? And do you have users using assistive technologies to visit your website? Do you have a specific usability test plan with some marginalized groups, like people with cognitive disabilities? And part 2 is the guidelines. It has 4 sections. I'm going to introduce them one by one. Yeah. The first thing of guidelines is, sorry, a little bit cut up. Yeah. The first thing of guidelines is about the use of language. Basically, it has 3 general guidelines, like to use inclusive language and terms, to use easy and clear English, and to ensure the translation quality. And as mentioned before by Tim, we are designing for people at the intersection, and our target audience has 2 backgrounds. So for say we are designing, we recommend users to use inclusive language and terms, but we will provide different examples for different backgrounds. For example, for cut groups, you need to avoid using like positive and patronizing comments, like you speak such good English, don't say that on your website. For people with cognitive disabilities, you need to avoid using terms like challenged or specially abled. Move on to the next theme, is about the design of interaction flow. So I will introduce this theme in 2 parts. Part 1 is about like how to help users understand the website content, how to help users find what they need, and how to help users avoid making mistakes. And an example given here is about helping users correct mistakes. So when errors occurred, you need to provide clear feedback, let users know what went wrong and what's the solutions they have. And for the solutions, you need to use clear step-by-step instructions. Possibly, you can use symbols or images to make it clear. And do not just show the articles. That is really user-unfriendly to our target audience, like people with low literacy or people with cognitive disabilities. And one of our participants also shared her experience about forgetting password when she was using MyGov. She said, I can't log in MyGov for now because my security questions got messed up like 100 years ago, and I just can't access it. So in her example, we know that even for people who are not from CAD community and without any cognitive disabilities, sometimes they still have difficulties getting out of the mistakes they made. So let alone our target audience who have been facing more barriers. So move on to the next slide. So it's still about the design of interaction flow. So yep. So it's about how to help users maintain focus, how to deliver a less memory-relied design, how to provide help and support, how to support personalization. And an example given here is about designing the help center. Currently, most of the help center there consists of a long list of QAs, which are mostly text-based, and this is very user-unfriendly to our target audience. And we have more expectations for the design of the help center. Like you need to provide translations. If you have users whose first language is not English, you need to provide alternative formats like images and videos for those text-based contents, especially for those complex concepts and tasks. And you need to provide human help, not just a chatbot, because some of our target audience prefer talking to customer service directly. And one of our participants also commented like this. She said, I can't use this blinking help scenes as English is my first language. I've got a tertiary degree. I still don't know what to do, you know. And I imagine if English is not my first language and I've got limited education, I would have absolutely no hope. So yeah, you need to take more care of the design of the help center. Move on to the next theme. Is about the accessibility of multimedia elements. Basically, it tells you what should be kept in mind when you considering placing like hyperlinks, images, videos, PDFs on your website. For example, placing images. You need to make sure all images have alt text, so users of screen readers can read the image content as other people do. Move on to the next thing. last thing is about assistive technologies. Basically, you need to support common assistive technologies like screen readers and magnifiers. And for example, to support screen readers, you need to, if your website has users of screen readers, you need to logically structure the website content and provide headings to help navigate, and all images need all text to so screen reader users can read image content. And most importantly, you need to always do the usability test with people using assistive technologies. And some other technologies include like screen magnifiers, voice recognition, and some technologies actually can effectively help improve the user experience of our target audience, but they have been missed out in the current design. Like one of our participants proposed an idea. She said, I've got a couple of people who are starting to learn to use Google Nest at home. So if we could train them and have devices like where people can ask questions in their own language and explain it to them, it would be so good. And she also pointed out that we've got many technologies available, but we still don't know how to adapt it in our design. So yeah, I think that's part of my introduction. Yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to Tim. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Zeng, for that wonderful overview of the majority of the results. So I'm just going to finish up with this last section of our findings, which is, I guess, where my interest mainly lies as someone who, I guess, doesn't do the hard work of what designers actually do. But this was around how disability is conceptualized. And I do acknowledge that, and I'll talk more about this later, that we didn't interview people with a lived experience, and we've got a question in the chat around usability testing for that. But what we found in this finding is that issue around trust, that having previous experiences with governments who maybe don't provide these type of services or can't be trusted to provide these services can lead people to feel like they can't actually use these services, especially when you're engaging through a website where you actually don't have a human being that you can build that trusting relationship with. A mismatch between cultures. So some migrants, our participants talked about being from collectivist cultures where this idea that you self-manage your NDIS portfolio and the NDIS is all about allowing you to live independently didn't always align with, in terms of the languages and the presentation of those ideas, with the values or ways that people in these communities understood disability. And that tied also into issues of stigma, that asking for help with a disability and actually putting that out there in public and sharing that information in certain words and in a certain way may actually be a barrier for some groups. But also around cultural norms for how you actually engage with services and whose role it is in terms of, is it the family's role, is it the individual's role, is it a professional services role to do this care? And just on my own personal reflection as someone who supports someone who is now accessing the NDIS, that's something that many of us probably experience as well, in terms of feeling like that, do we get someone to do this work or should we do this as a family? But that's probably a stronger emotional and value-driven response we found from our participants for this specific community. So one of the things that I was thinking about when going through this is about how do we conceptualize this intersectionality? Because one thing that has been done in the design space historically is the idea of a double burden. If you've got someone who comes from multiple different contexts of vulnerability, then they must just have double the burden. They've got the burden of this group and the burden of that group. And in some ways that's true. People from a cold community with a cognitive disability experience some of the barriers that cold people do, or communities do, and some of the barriers that people with cognitive disabilities do. But what is probably more important from a design perspective, especially when we're thinking about services that people don't have a choice whether they access, is what unique usability and accessibility issues arise at that intersection. So for us, some of the things we found and we've discussed with our participants is that someone with a cognitive disability may actually face barriers actually understanding how disability is defined and conceptualized in Australia, and being able to overcome some of that potential cognitive dissonance if they have values instilled from their home culture or from the culture in which they grew up in. But I think one of the key findings I want everyone here to take away, and what I've taken away from my future research, is how do we actually explore the intersectionality? And that's kind of where I'm going next in terms of how do we explore this intersectionality with people with a lived experience. So beyond our general usability in terms of how do we design for different cognitive abilities, how do we design for different languages, the next question is, how do we actually present information to people who may interpret that information in a number of ways, either because of differing cognitive abilities, different cultural backgrounds, and the intersection of these two things? And at the moment, Zeng and me are doing another project where we're going out and we're talking to UX designers and product managers about how they currently do their design work and how they might design for this population and what barriers they face. And I think what is interesting is personalization is a really contentious issue. You know, we design websites and we try and design them for as many people as possible. And sometimes we give options for personalization. But when does personalization become too much? You know, giving people options increases the cognitive load, which is challenging for many groups, not just people with different cognitive abilities. So is it such that for government services, for essential services, that they just need multiple platforms, that they can't just have one generic website? And, you know, obviously that brings up issues of cost and of resourcing. So moving forward in terms of future work, my goal in terms of the person who is the custodian of this project at the moment is to think about how we develop and create spaces for co-design. In a master's project, which, you know, started as a very short 5 or 6 week project and has now likely continued, it is very hard to authentically engage people with a lived experience. You know, I find that even in my own research work, and our previous speakers addressed that really well, I think. So what I'm thinking about now is how can we go out and work with community groups who are already asking these questions and learn from them and contribute our resources as a university to supporting them. The other question we're asking in the work Zeng's doing now is how do we translate these guidelines to actual methods? We've got that checklist of questions, which I think is really helpful in terms of spurring thinking and ideation, but how do these translate to the specific methods we use in usability testing, in co-design, in creating personas and journey maps, etc. In the long term, we're hoping to pilot these design guidelines with digital government services or essential services, but also to explore how we specify these guidelines for different disability, but also different culturally and linguistically diverse communities, because these cultural disability intersections, we think, and the literature would say, are probably going to be different across different communities. And I think the main thing is not to have to map all of them, but to work out how we use good methods to actually explore them. And these design guidelines will hopefully be the starting point for designers to think about that. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear the work you're doing, work out how we might have potential collaborations in this space. But here are some references, which I hope are helpful. And I look forward, and I'm sure Zeng looks forward as well, to hearing your questions. And while Theo is jumping on, I might answer this first question from Stevie. So Stevie has asked in the questions box, well, they say, I'm working on an NDIS project at the moment for support workers and providers. Do you have any advice on usability testing for people with a disability? This is a really interesting question. When I first started the work in this space, I met with some of the peak groups in the disability space. And what I was told, and something I've tried to hold very close in my work, is the best way to work out the best methods is to just ask people with a disability. And, you know, nothing about us without us is the kind of saying that has gone along in the disability space for a long time now. So I'd say, Stevie, if you're not sure, probably just ask. And that's a huge challenge, right? Because there's a big gap in terms of how do we actually go out and even start initial conversations. You know, if we've got a project we're working on which hasn't come from a community or a group of people with a disability, so we've come up with a project, we've defined it, and then we go out and we ask for buy-in, I think there's a lot of relationship building that has to go along in that space. Otherwise, really, it becomes very transactional. And yes, you might get an answer from them and you might get the method you want, But if you keep going back and keep asking for these transactions for them to be involved, they'll probably say no. And I found in my research, which mostly focuses in the context of mental health, having that ongoing relationship and learning from people and evolving the project with them, if that's possible, is probably a more powerful approach, but isn't always possible in UX design roles. So does anyone else have any other questions?
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Zeng, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
I really appreciate it. People went to focus groups after they decided what they're doing. Yeah, appreciate it, and I think what you guys are doing is fantastic. The reason why I say that is because I'm in South Africa, we have 12 official languages, and that's South Africans. That besides people from outside of our borders, and the one thing that's just sprung to mind is that when we go to our ATM, it's only up until about a month ago. What was happening is if you want to get your card back, you had to press cancel. Or once you finished your transaction, you press cancel or reject, whatever they said before. And they've now changed the language to give my card back, which I think was brilliant. Simple, very simple. And everyone could understand it because I speak 2 languages. Majority of people speak 2 or 3 languages. On average, you speak about 2 or 3 languages in South Africa. And our language is still very much gray. Even me speaking English as my first language, I couldn't get my ATM card out of a machine for years and years and years. So that sort of just changed. So I appreciate it. I think it's something that's going to go a long way. And I think that definitely we'd love to discuss more sort of collaboration once you guys have finished your thesis. But I appreciate it. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.